The neon light in front of the grocery store was still casting its glow when Gwen Porter vanished in the Compton residential area, California, population over 70,000 people. The October night laid down thick fog over the narrow alleys, the cold air sweeping in from the edges of Los Angeles, blending sounds into the darkness. At 10:03 p.m., the nearby shop owner waved when he saw Gwen, the 21-year-old, who had just finished her shift, walking across the concrete path leading to the parking lot. In her hand was still the small, frayed-strap bag she carried every evening, the one her mom gave her back in her senior year of high school. The shop owner watched Gwen's figure gradually disappear behind the damp brick wall, her light blue denim jacket, the last splash of color before the alley swallowed every trace. Before we dive deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of the latest cases. That night, Compton was covered in a thin layer of mist, the streetlights casting a dull yellowish glow that made the road look like it was slowly sinking into darkness. Cold wind blew in reverse from the direction of Long Beach across the rows of low houses, carrying the damp sea smell and the faint rustling from the trembling rows of trees. Every time a car passed on the I-105 freeway, the sound echoed down into the neighborhood, creating steady, deep vibrations that made the quiet space feel even more suffocating. The old power poles crackled, brief flickers of electricity making the light brighten and dim in turns. Under that scene, Gwen Porter, 21 years old, finished her shift at the small grocery store right at the corner of Rosecrans Avenue. She slung her bag over her shoulder, closed the door, pulled her thin jacket tight against her neck to block the cold, then stepped onto the familiar path leading to the parking lot 2 blocks away. Gwen's footsteps made small, even sounds, echoing lightly on the concrete still damp from the night mist. She walked alone, no phone conversation, no stopping, not looking around much because she had taken this route hundreds of times. The 3 shops on both sides of the road had already turned off their lights, with only one nail salon still slightly open, its light spilling out into the mist and creating a thin white halo. The salon owner, while cleaning up, glanced outside and saw Gwen passing by with her usual hurried yet calm demeanor of someone far too familiar with the evening routine. No one followed behind Gwen. No one crossed the street toward her. There were no other footsteps besides hers, and no actions signaling any confrontation. Gwen turned into the alley leading out to the main road, where a single streetlight shone straight down, stretching her shadow long across the cold concrete. The mist clung to Gwen's hair and jacket, moving gently with each step she took. The sounds of the city faded farther away, leaving only the wind slipping through wall gaps and the taut electrical wires humming in steady pulses. As Gwen walked deeper into the alley, the nail salon owner's line of sight was blocked by the corner of the wall. That was also the last moment anyone saw her. Time continued to pass in silence. Inside the Porter family home, the wall clock ticked each second slowly and heavily. Gwen still hadn't come home. The landline rang, then stopped, no one answering. Another call, then more calls, but no response from Gwen. Her parents started stepping out into the yard, looking down the road leading home and trying to spot any familiar figure. As the worry grew, the whole family decided to drive to the area where Gwen worked, hoping she had gotten stuck somewhere. They asked the grocery store employees, asked the nail salon owner who was still open, asked the few people still out on the street, but everyone gave the same information. Gwen had left the store like every other day, nothing out of the ordinary. The family continued searching the neighborhood, shining flashlights along the small alleys, calling Gwen's name into the silence of the night. There was not a single sign that she was still in the area. When every possibility of searching on their own yielded no results, the Porter family returned home, picked up the phone, and called the police. The first patrol team arrived at the area where Gwen was last seen while the fog still hung heavy and the yellowish streetlights hadn't yet lost their glare. They began sweeping the route from the grocery store out to the parking lot, following exactly the path Gwen usually took. The concrete surface was still damp, reflecting a pale silver light from the sky that made every small detail stand out if anything was off. Right as they stepped into the alley, one officer crouched down, swept his flashlight close to the ground, and noticed a section of the concrete had been lightly disturbed, as if something heavy had scraped across it or someone had moved in a hurry. There were no deep gouges or strong skid marks, but the slight displacement in the thin layer of dust covering the surface showed movement that didn't follow the normal trajectory of a walking person. Not far from that spot, a small object lay right against the base of the wall, partially hidden under a thin layer of mist. It was so minor that no one dared claim it was connected to Gwen's disappearance, but its appearance right in the unusual area made the officers collect it for examination. They placed it in an evidence bag without making any judgments, since its origin and the time it fell couldn't yet be determined. Based on the account from the only witness, the investigative team reconstructed Gwen's path by moving slowly, step by step, as she might have done. They identified points with strong lighting, blind corners, narrow sections of the alley, and compiled them into a preliminary sketch. In that sketch, there was one segment Gwen stepped into, but no one saw her exit. A small area blocked from view by a high wall and a row of large trash bins. This was considered the vanishing gap, where she passed in silence, and where traces could have been erased or obscured. The discolored bricks and the thick darkness in the corner of the alley made this spot the focal point of attention. There were no clear signs of a struggle. No blood, no indications of resistance on the ground. Nothing was knocked over. No walls were scratched. No frantic running shoe prints. No forceful movements visible to the naked eye. That led to an important conclusion. The perpetrator, if one existed, had approached Gwen very quickly, in a way that gave her no chance to make noise or leave signs of resistance. The officers searched the surrounding area for cameras but were disappointed to find no recording systems positioned exactly where needed. An ATM camera a few dozen meters away didn't cover the alley. The two nearest businesses used halogen bulbs without any security setup. The entire stretch Gwen walked was almost completely outside visual control. A deviation of just a few steps had left the case missing the most critical piece of information in modern investigations: the victim's direction of travel and signs of the suspect's approach. This very absence of visual data made the investigation difficult right from the first hours. While the officers documented the scene, the youngest in the group, Ray Morris, stood observing the entire structure of the alley, the choke points, the streetlight brightness, and the distance from the store to where Gwen was lost. Ray noticed something the others hadn't yet picked up on. The spot where Gwen vanished wasn't a random area. It was the segment with the weakest lighting, the most visual obstructions, and the point where someone could stand waiting in the shadows without being noticed. The distance from the store to that position was just enough for the victim to feel safe, but far enough that people in the store could no longer see her. Ray noted this calculation in his notebook. In his view, this wasn't a spontaneous act. The terrain features suggested someone had chosen the exact weak point of the route, surveilled it long enough to know Gwen's rhythm, and understood precisely when she would appear at the advantageous spot for closing in. With no signs of a struggle and no recorded cries, Ray leaned toward this being an abduction carried out in an extremely short window, far more plausible than the possibility that Gwen had simply left the area on her own. The investigative team continued sweeping every meter of the alley, measuring every disturbance and the light hitting the surface, searching for traces showing how and in which direction Gwen had been moved out of the area. The initial findings showed this wasn't a simple missing person case, but they also didn't provide any clear answers. The scant clues forced the whole team to focus on the tiniest details because, at that moment, those were all they had. The rows of houses around the area where Gwen disappeared were cordoned off with temporary boundaries so the search team could begin expanding the sweep radius. The nighttime air still held on to its chill, making every sound carry farther than usual as the officers combed through each vacant lot. Compton Creek, with its dense bushes growing right along both banks of the water, was considered the first point to check because of its rough terrain and numerous dark pockets that could easily hide traces. Flashlight beams swept across the dark, murky water but revealed nothing beyond floating algae and drifting trash. The search team spread out along the creek's edge, using long poles to probe into the thick grass for anything thrown down or left behind. But they only found plastic bottles, plastic bags, and a few pieces of rotted wood. There was no sign of Gwen. They continued moving through the neighboring residential area, where alleys crisscrossed like a web. Lights from apartments flicked on as some residents noticed the police passing by, but no one reported hearing any noteworthy sounds around the time Gwen went missing. The alleys all shared the same scene. Trash bins crammed against walls, old cars parked tight to the curb, ground speckled with oil stains. The search team moved slowly and systematically so as not to miss any detail. When one group reached an area about a few dozen meters from the alley where Gwen vanished, an object lying right against the base of the wall made them stop. Under the flashlight beam, it was a piece of moss-green nylon cord, a few inches long and slightly frayed at one end. This type of nylon is typically used for tying down or securing heavy items. Unlike anything Gwen carried with her, its material didn't match her clothing or bag. An officer picked it up, wearing gloves, placed it in an evidence bag, and marked the location on the map. Its presence in the area near the disappearance point was a detail worth noting because it didn't fit the usual landscape that only held household trash. From the nylon, the search team shifted attention to the ground around it. A few shoe prints appeared but were blurred by dust and night mist. There were no clear tread patterns to determine size or shoe type. The examiner could only tell they were from rubber-soled shoes, larger than average, and the steps seemed heavy. However, the prints weren't deep enough to serve forensic purposes or allow for comparison. These prints veered off in a direction different from Gwen's path, adding even more uncertainty to the initial analysis. The officers continued straight to the abandoned parking lot not far away, where rusted cars sat motionless under the shadows of tall eucalyptus trees, creating a scene that was both quiet and eerie. The area was shielded from the main road by an old iron fence, many sections rusted and falling apart. The lot had long been a place where people dumped junk, so the ground was cluttered with scrap metal and old paint cans. The search team checked each vehicle, shone lights underneath, opened doors on any that could still be opened, inspected back seats, trunks, and floors. They found no sign of Gwen or anything clearly related. No blood, no fabric, no newly appeared items. Though no results came from it, checking the parking lot helped rule out the possibility that the victim had been temporarily hidden in that area. When compiling all the search points within the wider radius, the investigative team noticed a suspicious consistency. Every trace, no matter how small, lacked the characteristics of chaos or resistance. This led to an early conclusion that if there was a perpetrator, he had acted with extreme speed, using an approach that left the victim no time to react. No scratch marks, no running tracks, no scattered dropped items, no strong disturbances on the ground. Everything pointed to an image of a capture carried out in an extremely short window by someone prepared and experienced. The investigative group noted a key point. The area where Gwen vanished had weak lighting and low foot traffic, perfect for an ambush. The appearance of the nylon cord and the faint shoe prints in the vicinity of the disappearance point caused many investigators to lean toward the possibility that the perpetrator wasn't acting impulsively, but was someone who had been stalking women in the area. From the method of approach and the limited traces left behind, they flagged that the suspect might belong to the group of urban predators, individuals knowledgeable enough to avoid leaving direct evidence at the scene. No further clear leads emerged within the expanded search radius. But those initial observations were enough for the investigative team to realize the case wasn't straightforward. What was gathered from that first night of searching showed the level of sophistication of whoever took Gwen out of the alley without leaving any easily recognizable action. When the investigative team returned to the residential area around the alley to collect statements, the first pieces of information quickly proved inconsistent. Witness A was a woman living in a second-floor apartment overlooking the road Gwen walked every evening. She recounted that in the moment she looked out the window, she saw Gwen walking alone, keeping her familiar pace, not turning her head, not stopping. She described Gwen appearing very clearly in her line of sight, with no one accompanying her or standing nearby. According to her, if anything unusual had happened, especially a stranger closing in, she would have noticed because the light from her apartment window shone straight down onto that section of the road. The way she recounted it didn't waver at all, showing certainty in her own observation. However, Witness B told a completely different story. He was standing outside a shop right at the intersection, smoking and tidying up a few items before locking up. He insisted he saw Gwen stop and talk to an unfamiliar man. According to him, they stood a few steps apart, not too close, but close enough to exchange a few words. He remembered it clearly because the man was quite a bit taller than Gwen and had his head slightly bowed, as if asking her something. He couldn't recall the man's facial features clearly due to the weak lighting, but he was certain Gwen wasn't alone at that moment. He saw them from a distance, for just a few seconds, through the streetlight's glow hitting the concrete. When asked if he could have mistaken Gwen for someone else, he denied it, saying he'd seen her familiar figure many times since he worked near the grocery store. His statement prompted the investigative team to note his standing position, angle of view, and distance from where he observed to the alley. Witness C told an even vaguer story, making the situation increasingly complicated. He was a resident, living in a small house near the alley. While cleaning up in his backyard, he heard a sound like something being dragged across the concrete. The sound wasn't loud, but enough to make him pause for a few seconds. However, it happened too quickly and didn't repeat, so he wasn't sure if the sound was real or just his mind playing tricks in the quiet evening. When he went out to the back gate to look toward the alley, no one was there. This made him unable to confirm whether the noise related to Gwen or was just a trash bin being knocked by the wind, since the area was often full of items easily moved by gusts. The three conflicting statements created three completely different investigative directions. If witness A was believed, Gwen left the area alone and vanished afterward. If witness B was believed, a man had approached Gwen, possibly even talking to her before she disappeared. And if witness C's account reflected the truth, a forceful action might have occurred quickly and quietly, enough to create a sound that only one person heard. The investigative team had to consider each witness's position, the lighting, line of sight, and distance to assess the accuracy of their statements. When they overlaid the map with each position, the officers began to recognize the complex elements of the scene. Witness A had a wide view but was limited by height and distance. Witness B was closer but had weak lighting and partial obstructions blocking the alley. Witness C heard a sound but saw no visuals, so the chance of misinterpretation was very high. However, when combining all three accounts, one striking common point emerged. Every scenario took place in an area obscured from the main sources of light. Whether Gwen walked alone, stood talking to someone, or was dragged away, those actions happened in a spot where, from a distance, people could only see shadows and vague movements, not distinguish anything precisely. The investigative team began questioning whether this was random or if someone had deliberately chosen the exact spot with the weakest light and least attention to approach Gwen. The conflicting statements prevented them from confirming any direction, but when synthesized, the investigators noticed that Gwen's disappearance occurred precisely at a point ideal for concealing an action. That alley had two high walls blocking light, a dead corner that the nearest ATM camera couldn't see, and it happened at a time with no passers-by. These factors created the sense of an area chosen not by chance. Ray Morris paid particular attention to how all three statements lacked absolute precision, but highlighted the same thing. The perpetrator, if there was one, had used the darkest part of the alley to avoid being seen directly. The contradictions between the statements didn't make the case clearer. They only added depth to its unpredictability, because in that darkness, any action could have taken place without leaving traces clear enough to identify. The investigative team was forced to note that at the place where Gwen vanished, it was highly likely someone had been watching or waiting, choosing the timing so that every eye around could only catch an incomplete fragment of the truth. As the investigative team continued sweeping the area around the alley, one officer spotted a small object lying right against the base of the wall, not far from where the nylon cord had been collected. The flashlight beam hit the dull metal surface and revealed it was a simple keychain, the kind Gwen usually carried to attach her locker key and work badge. The keychain was covered in a thin layer of dust, with clear scratches on two edges, as if it had been slammed hard against the concrete or yanked from its owner's hand in a sudden motion. When picked up, the officer noticed the hook part was slightly bent, something that couldn't happen if it had simply fallen naturally from a bag. The item was placed in an evidence bag, with the exact time and position marked on the scene map. Ray Morris checked the distance between the keychain's location and where the nylon cord was found. Then observed the shape of the path between the 2 points. The distance was only a few steps, and when standing there, Ray realized the view from the main road was almost completely blocked by tall trash bins stacked against the wall, making this spot so concealed that anyone stepping in for just a few seconds would vanish from the sight of any witness standing out on the street. Ray examined the keychain's fall position on the ground again, and noticed it wasn't in the center of the alley, but offset to one side, exactly where someone being pulled or pushed might accidentally drop a personal item. The scratch patterns on the keychain weren't even. One edge was long, thin, and sharp, while the other was shorter and shallower. This made Ray think the object had contacted the concrete surface at multiple different angles, suggesting it wasn't a straight drop but had been dragged along the ground in a hurried motion. When combined with the earlier nylon cord, Ray noted in his notebook that the 2 pieces of evidence appeared within a small radius and lay along the same line of travel, proving this area was directly tied to the interruption in Gwen's journey. The positional coincidence prompted Ray to re-examine the walls on both sides, the alley's width, the streetlight's position, and the shielding effect of the trash bins. Every feature pointed to the possibility that the perpetrator had subdued Gwen by approaching from behind or from a dead angle in the shadows. The second piece of evidence wasn't some randomly dropped item. Ray used a measuring tape on the position, recording the distance from the keychain to the wall base, then measured the offset to infer the final direction of Gwen's movement before she was pulled away. The small deviation to the left, where the fine dust layer was broken into a short streak, suggested Gwen's foot or shoe movement might have caused that disturbance. There were no clear scrape or push marks, which fit the assessment that Gwen had been subdued very quickly, with no time to make noise or mount strong resistance. When shining light farther around the keychain's drop point, Ray noticed the thin dust coating on the concrete had 2 unevenly wiped areas. One long streak at ankle height, another smaller one near where the keychain lay. Nothing could confirm it for sure, but such dust wipe patterns often appear when someone is spun around or pulled sideways during restraint. This reinforced the conclusion that Gwen had been forced into a sudden change of direction rather than voluntarily altering her route. Ray marked the 2 dust wipe zones and the keychain position on the alley diagram, forming a small triangle of 3 points that indicated where the abnormal movement occurred. He also added the nylon cord's position, creating a single connecting line in the tight space and suggesting the perpetrator's approach and pull direction toward the least lit area. Through the physical scene observation, Ray saw that dragging the victim a few steps, then loading her into a waiting vehicle was entirely feasible in that space. The high walls blocked views from both sides. Streetlight illumination was limited, and no windows faced directly toward the incident spot. The investigative team used chalk to mark suspicious points on the ground, measured wall heights, and calculated the shadow area created by the single overhead light. Everything led to the conclusion that the perpetrator may have prepared the location in advance, fully aware that this alley created poor visibility from the outside. Ray particularly noted that the keychain fell right at the edge of the dark zone, while the nylon cord lay closer to the alley's center. This distribution suggested continuous movement from the entry point to the point of control. Though small, the evidence items carried significant locational value, helping confirm where Gwen was approached and providing a clearer view of how the perpetrator manipulated the scene. With these observations, Ray created the first detailed diagram of the abduction area, marking suspected waiting spots for the perpetrator, points where Gwen could have been pulled off course, and the most likely direction the victim was taken. This area became the focal point of the entire investigation, because every clue converged within just a few square meters where Gwen was separated from her familiar path in a fleeting moment. When the first pieces of evidence were identified, the investigative team began reconstructing the entire timeline of the night Gwen disappeared. Co-workers from the same shift confirmed that Gwen left the store right after closing out the day's final tally, a time recorded by the clock at the checkout counter. From that moment until the family started calling to look for Gwen was a clearly pinpointed window, helping narrow down the space and time when the victim was separated from her usual routine. After cross-referencing statements, the investigative team determined there was a complete blank period of 6 to 7 minutes, with no record from any witness. This was the gap between when Gwen stepped into the alley and before the family's first unanswered call. This blank became the focal point because every trace led back to it. Based on Gwen's average walking speed derived from her daily walking habit and the length of the route from the store to the parking lot, Ray Morris calculated that she would need about 3 to 4 minutes to complete the path. This meant that if Gwen hadn't encountered anyone or been obstructed, she would have reached the parking lot before the family's first call. However, the fact that she never arrived showed the interruption happened very close to when she left the store. When piecing together all the facts, Ray placed the first marker at the keychain's drop position. This spot sat near the center of the blank time window, coinciding with when Gwen would have been midway along her route. This proved Gwen's journey was cut short not at the start of her walk, nor near the parking lot, but right when she passed through the weakest lit section of the alley. To strengthen the inference, Ray compared the store's closing time with when the nail salon owner saw Gwen walk by. Both markers showed Gwen appeared on schedule as usual, with no unusual change in her routine. The nail salon owner clearly remembered that when Gwen passed, she still walked with her steady, calm stride, indicating she hadn't encountered any threat up to that point. This helped establish that the restraint action occurred just seconds after she turned into the alley and disappeared from the witness's view. Ray continued cross-checking average step speed, with the time needed for Gwen to move from the witness's sighting position to where the keychain fell. That distance would take only about 20 to 30 seconds at a normal pace. The keychain wasn't merely a dropped item. It became a precise time marker, hinting at the exact moment Gwen was approached. The scratches on the keychain and its offset position toward the wall led Ray to conclude the victim was pulled off her original direction of travel. The slight bend in the hook, combined with the long, streaky scratch, suggested it was yanked hard rather than simply falling, meaning Gwen was taken by surprise the instant she reached the dark part of the alley. From here, when plotting events on the diagram, Ray saw the perpetrator approached Gwen from behind or from a blind corner right against the wall. The narrow road structure and high walls made a frontal approach nearly impossible because Gwen would have seen it and reacted. Approaching from behind created the conditions for the victim to have no time to turn or call for help. The lack of any recorded noise from surrounding houses also supported the possibility that the perpetrator used a method to block her voice or prevent outcry. The tight space between the two walls allowed the perpetrator to close in with just 1 or 2 steps. This created an ideal attack path for someone familiar with the terrain, choosing the moment when the victim was completely off guard. Ray combined this assessment with the nylon cord recovered nearby. The frayed nylon could have contacted the concrete while the perpetrator used it to secure or drag the victim away. Based on the positions of the nylon and keychain, Ray redrew the diagram of the perpetrator's movement path. That path didn't go straight but veered left, then curved back, similar to the route of someone dragging a heavy object or person in a direction hard to see from the main road. The 6 to 7 minute blank became crucial because it showed the perpetrator acted so quickly that no one had time to hear or see anything. There were no clear struggle signs beyond the 2 dust wipe areas. No loud sounds. No items flung aside except the keychain. The perpetrator had to carry out the entire restraint within less than a minute, then remove the victim from the alley during the remaining part of the time gap. These facts indicated the perpetrator had experience approaching targets by tailing from behind, selecting the exact spot and moment to strike without creating major noise. He likely had observed Gwen beforehand, knew her route clearly, and identified the weakest point on her path. The timeline diagram Ray reconstructed reflected this calculation, showing the perpetrator's behavior bore the hallmarks of someone accustomed to hunting in urban settings, exploiting blind spots in lighting, and rapid approach speed to neutralize the victim without leaving abnormal sounds. When analyzing the timeline and marking the area where the restraint occurred, the investigative team expanded their efforts to gather statements from women who lived or worked around the point where Gwen disappeared. Just a few hours later, 3 women who didn't know each other unexpectedly recounted similar experiences in the weeks leading up to Gwen's disappearance. The first was a waitress at a restaurant not far from the grocery store. She said that when getting off shift around the same time as Gwen, she had once heard footsteps following her along a dark stretch of road, though when she turned around, no one was there. At the time, She thought it might be just a regular passerby until a man's voice came from the shadows asking if she needed a ride home. The voice was deep, slightly hoarse, with an odd rhythm like it caught at the end of sentences. She declined and walked quickly toward the light, after which she no longer heard the man. The second was a young woman living near Compton Creek. She said that for 3 consecutive nights, when walking from her parking spot back to her apartment, she saw a tall figure standing against the wall at the end of the alley. Each time she passed, the figure didn't approach but followed her with his eyes so intently that she clearly felt the watching. She described the man as taller than average, broad-shouldered, with brown hair that fell long down the back of his neck, slightly curly and messy, as if he didn't care about grooming. She remembered the empty look in his eyes that she sensed when the streetlight slanted across his face. The third was a supermarket worker on the night shift. She recounted that one time when closing up, she saw a tall man standing next to an abandoned bus stop. As she walked by, he muttered something unclear, but the distinctly hoarse voice gave her chills. She pushed her car door open quickly and drove away just seconds later. These statements came in independently, but when placed side by side, the investigative team noticed striking consistencies. The unusually hoarse voice wasn't just deep, it was the kind of rough hoarseness from someone who'd had laryngeal trauma or had been a heavy smoker for years. The tall build and superior stature were repeated details. The empty gaze and long brown hair at the nape created a consistent image. No one described the face clearly, but all remembered the feeling of being watched, something that particularly caught Ray Morris's attention. When plotting the 3 statements on the area map, Ray saw that all the appearances of the unknown man occurred within a radius of about 600 meters around the grocery store where Gwen worked. That distance wasn't large enough for a stalker to move on foot between points without drawing attention. The time frames the 3 women recalled all fell in the evening, mostly between around 8 p.m. and 10 p.m., exactly the window when Gwen usually finished her shift. This led Ray to question whether Gwen had been under observation beforehand. The common description from the 3 witnesses showed this man didn't pick targets randomly. He appeared multiple times, always in the shadows, always watching lone women, and never made an aggressive approach right away. He seemed to study movement habits, test reactions, and evaluate each person before selecting a suitable target. The overlap in timing between the stalking incidents and Gwen's shift end further strengthened the likelihood she had been targeted. Ray compared the time and space structure between the statements and the keychain drop position, noticing that the unknown man's behavior was calculated. He didn't act in well-lit areas, but chose precisely the shadowed zones, where visibility was blocked and footsteps were drowned out by distant traffic noise. With his tall frame and ability to move quietly, he could close in on a victim in just a few steps without making enough sound to attract notice. This matched what the investigative team had documented at the scene. No screams, no struggle sounds, no impacts. Ray marked the locations where the 3 women had seen the suspect, forming points that lay along an arc encircling Gwen's usual route. When connected, the movement pattern resembled the sweeping patrol of a mobile predator, not stationary, always adjusting position to observe from different angles. Notably, 2 of the 3 sighting points were very close to where Gwen turned into the alley before she vanished, suggesting the suspect may have acted as a lookout for the area, watching as Gwen passed by. The investigators fed the 3 statements into the behavioral analysis group. The profile matched the type who avoids direct confrontation at first, but repeatedly appears near young women, fitting the pattern of offenders who seek accessible targets. Evaluate victims before striking. He didn't attack the earlier witnesses, possibly because they were near strong light or in easily observable areas. That showed he knew how to pick the right moment. The descriptions of the empty gaze also evoked the image of someone with emotional detachment, or a tendency to emotionally disconnect when viewing victims, common in offenders who enjoy controlling others' bodies. Ray also flagged a hoarse voice as a key element. It was a feature too rare to be coincidental across 3 independent accounts. The distinctly hoarse, hard-to-read emotion voice could be the suspect's strongest identifying trait. When synthesizing this description with the rapid, silent approach method, Ray built an initial behavioral model. A tall man with good strength, accustomed to moving in darkness, capable of observing and tailing without revealing himself, and acting with the calm of someone who knows how to neutralize a victim before they can react. This model helped the investigative team begin focusing on suspects who habitually moved at night in the area, had histories of stalking women or causing disturbances, and matched similar physical appearance and voice characteristics. The information from the 3 statements wasn't enough to identify a specific person, but it created a crucial foundation for understanding that every night in the area, a patient predator was watching, selecting, and waiting for the exact moment to act. When the initial behavioral model of the predator was constructed, the investigative team launched a second large-scale search, focusing on areas within a close radius of where Gwen disappeared. This time, it included support from a K9 team trained to detect human traces in urban environments. The working dogs were brought to each suspected point, starting from the alley and extending out to vacant lots, parking areas, spots along Compton Creek, and patches of ground that hadn't been thoroughly checked on the first night. After nearly an hour of moving through multiple stretches without any particular reaction, one K9 suddenly stopped in front of a plot of land sandwiched between 2 rows of old houses where grass grew tall and the soil surface showed signs of disturbance. This plot wasn't on Gwen's usual route, but it was only a few dozen meters from the alley, close enough to consider it an area the perpetrator could have used to temporarily hide something. The dog barked softly and turned back multiple times, signaling the presence of human scent or organic traces buried under the soil layer. The officers immediately cordoned off the area and used small shovels to dig up a layer of dirt for inspection. The soil was looser than normal, as if it had been dug recently. Everyone paused in tension, because the location and the K9's reaction made them all think they might find Gwen. However, as the soil was peeled away bit by bit, there was no human body underneath. Instead, they found a few small scraps of fabric and a torn nylon bag, indicating whatever had been buried was no longer there. When digging deeper, a strand of long hair stuck to the damp soil emerged. The forensics team collected the hair strand immediately and made a preliminary check by observing color and structure. It was women's hair, dark brown, longer than Gwen's hair. When compared to descriptions and photos of Gwen, there were no matching characteristics. This hair also didn't resemble that of any family member, confirmed through available comparison sample images. This discovery made Ray Morris pause. It couldn't be a mistake, because the hair's find location in the disturbed plot didn't align with Gwen's path. The appearance of this unfamiliar hair strand led the investigative team to a troubling possibility. The area around the alley where Gwen vanished might have previously been a site where another woman was restrained, threatened, or taken through. The information gathered from the 3 prior statements about the unknown man with the hoarse voice and tall build made this hair strand even more significant. A hair sample appearing in the area suggested that the suspect's behavior wasn't limited to the night Gwen went missing. If the hair didn't belong to Gwen or anyone known to Gwen, it meant this place had once involved the presence of another woman at an undetermined time. The fact that no one was found under the soil indicated that if someone had been hidden there, they had since been moved, or the buried item was just trash from a different criminal event. The investigative team had to split resources into 2 parallel directions. The first direction continued searching for Gwen in patches of land, scrap yards, dense brush areas, wall edges, and places the perpetrator could have dragged a victim through. The second direction pursued traces of the unknown man to verify whether he was connected to this newly found hair strand as well. They couldn't merge the 2 investigative paths into one, because each required different methods. One was searching for a currently missing victim. The other was tracking a suspect showing signs of repeated activity. Ray Morris recorded the disturbed plot's location on the comprehensive scene diagram. When connecting the pieces of evidence, the nylon cord, the keychain, the dust wipe areas, the statements about the man stalking women, and now this unfamiliar hair strand, a map of anomalous points began to emerge. None of the points coincided with ordinary resident paths, but all lay within the shadowed network of small alleys where visibility was blocked by walls and the shadows of long-parked vehicles. When analyzing the terrain, Ray noticed the dug-up plot sat exactly at a spot where someone wanting to temporarily hide something could do so without detection. The soil was soft, foot traffic was low, and there was enough brush to mask odors until the K9 detected it. This showed the spot had been used by someone familiar with the area, who knew how to choose a place hard to observe from the outside. The hair discovery raised the severity level because it proved activity related to the area hadn't happened just once. The investigative team had to redraw the entire diagram marking where witnesses had seen the unknown man and cross-reference it with the hair find position. The overlap in range made them realize the individual appearing in those statements might have been so familiar with the area that he could move back and forth and use it for concealment purposes. The emergence of this new evidence complicated the case in an unexpected way. Up to this point, all inferences had focused on finding Gwen and determining the sequence of events within a single night. But the unfamiliar hair strand expanded the scope of events, forcing the investigative team to recognize that the area around the alley wasn't simply the site of one sudden incident. It may have been used before for another act involving another woman at a time no one witnessed. That realization confronted the investigative team with a heavy possibility. They weren't just pursuing a victim, but might also be following the trail of a perpetrator who had operated multiple times in the darkness of Compton's alleys. The expanded search efforts, the terrain sweeps, the small but suggestive pieces of evidence were all added to the file, but when the investigative team compiled all the information, the absence of a key element prevented the case from moving forward any further. There was no body, no direct eyewitness to the crime itself, no clear identification of the man who appeared in the shadows, and no usable DNA from any evidence due to the technology limitations of that time. The nylon cord didn't have enough biological material for analysis, the keychain only bore scratch marks without clear fingerprints, and the unfamiliar hair strand couldn't be traced to an identity in an era before gene-matching systems existed. All of this made Gwen's file thin and fragile in the hands of those who had spent weeks trying to piece together the scattered fragments. In the evidence room, a small oversight that no one noticed right away quietly undermined the investigation's progress. One piece of evidence, a small metal fragment found near the nylon cord's location, was mislabeled during intake. That metal piece had originally been collected as something suspected of showing signs of heavy impact, but with the wrong case code, it was placed in the group of items with unidentified origins and no longer prioritized for analysis. This minor error caused it to be forgotten for years in the cold drawer of the storage warehouse, lying dormant among hundreds of other pieces of evidence, unnoticed that it had once been close to where Gwen was pulled away. The DNA technology limitations at that time meant most evidence couldn't be exploited. Samples like the nylon, the unfamiliar women's hair, or the dust clinging to the road surface yielded no results because the processes for separation, amplification, and comparison weren't advanced enough to generate data, especially when traces had been degraded by time and environmental conditions. For the investigative team, waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist equated to being stalled from the start. Without usable DNA, every hypothesis remained suspended in midair, with no anchor to verify it. Reports were written in full, but the thicker they grew, the more they highlighted the core absence. No trail to follow. When every available trace led to a dead end, the investigation slowed, then came to a standstill. Ray Morris and the other investigating officers didn't want to give up, but they also couldn't manufacture evidence from the gaps. They returned to the scene multiple times, swept additional alleys, questioned dozens more residents, but no new discoveries emerged. With each passing day, hope of finding something faded because the passage of time blurred every trace that could only have been detected in those first hours. When 3 months brought no progress at all, Gwen's file was reviewed under procedure and concluded that the case no longer met the criteria for active investigation. A thick file containing maps, notes, evidence, and statements was carefully closed and placed in the special drawer reserved for unsolved cases. From that point on, Gwen's disappearance was officially transferred to the cold case unit. Her name was added to the list of victims for whom police couldn't find answers during the initial investigation period. News of the file being closed spread through the community, sparking weeks of discussion among Compton residents. Some believed Gwen might have simply left, but most knew that a young woman vanishing in minutes right in the middle of a residential area was never random. With no suspect to pursue, no new leads to chase, and no body to confirm anything, the case sank into a heavy silence. In scattered conversations years later, people still referred to the alley where Gwen disappeared as a place holding something inexplicable. The unfamiliar hair strands, the frayed nylon cord, the bent keychain, and the vague accounts of the man with the hoarse voice became disjointed fragments of memory that no one could assemble into a complete picture. Their obscurity turned Gwen's case into one of Compton's greatest mysteries, a story no one could explain, a lingering void between truth and silence, preserved in the cold files as a reminder that some things happened without anyone having the tools to see them fully. In 1998, more than a decade after Gwen disappeared, the Cold Case Unit of Los Angeles County conducted a review of unsolved missing persons cases in the Compton area and surrounding regions. When revisiting Gwen's file, a new investigator who had recently joined the unit, one with a habit of looking for recurring patterns across old cases, noticed a particularly striking similarity between Gwen's case and two other women's disappearances that occurred in 1986 and 1987. Both of those earlier cases received little public attention at the time they happened, mainly because there were no bodies and no clear signs of violence. However, when placed alongside Gwen's case, small details began to form a troubling pattern of coincidence. In the first case, a 22-year-old woman vanished after leaving a laundromat close to 10 p.m. She walked home alone to her apartment a few blocks away but never arrived. Only one witness saw her turn into a quiet street, and after that, no one saw her again. The disappearance window lasted just a few minutes, much like Gwen's case. The second case happened in 1986. A 25-year-old woman left her workplace late at night. She stepped into the residential parking lot and vanished in a short enough span that no one noticed anything unusual. In both cases, police at the time found no signs of a struggle, no cries for help, no significant physical evidence, and no usable DNA because technology back then was still rudimentary. Those similarities prompted the Cold Case Unit to place all three files side by side on the long table in the workroom. As they read through each report line by line, the parallels stood out sharply. All incidents occurred at night, when the neighborhoods were quiet and lighting was dim. The victims were all young women walking alone. All three cases were documented within a radius of no more than a few miles around Compton. Each disappearance happened in an extremely brief time frame, making any investigation difficult. One investigator compared maps of the three locations and realized the disappearance points formed a not-too-large triangle, with the interior containing a residential area full of dark alleys and poorly lit parking lots. The fact that the cases clustered in the same general area made random coincidence harder to accept. The investigative team began compiling a detailed comparison chart for each case. The time the victim left, the last seen location, the expected travel route, lighting conditions, pedestrian traffic at the time, victim's personal characteristics, and scene features suggesting the approacher's behavior. The fuller the chart became, the more overlaps appeared. In all three cases, the victims vanished within 4 to 7 minutes after leaving a place where someone had seen them. None had any reason to leave voluntarily, and none were recorded as having conflicts or disputes with others. No screams, no struggle signs, no audio clues, a calculated form of silence. A veteran investigator in the group said all three cases carried the mark of surveillance. The perpetrators seemed to judge precisely when the victim separated from lighted areas and slipped out of witness view. That behavior suggested a level of preparation or prior observation. When rereading the old statements from the three women who had been followed, the descriptive traits began to stand out with repetition. Tall build, long brown hair at the nape, empty gaze, and hoarse voice. Though those statements had once lacked enough weight to identify a specific suspect, when placed alongside the three disappearances, they formed an additional layer of information, showing a man who had been present multiple times in the area, appearing on quiet nights and paying particular attention to lone women walking. The investigative group noted that in all three disappearances, the victims used routes with narrow, dimly lit, visually obstructed segments, positions that someone familiar with the terrain could exploit to lie in wait. Without DNA or direct witnesses, the repeated behavior across three different locations in 2 consecutive years led the team to consider the possibility of a perpetrator operating according to his own pattern. They drafted a preliminary behavioral model, a man active within the Compton area and vicinity, targeting young women walking alone at night, approaching in dark zones, carrying out rapid, silent restraint. This person may have observed for days beforehand to learn the victim's habits. They further noted that none of the 3 cases left signs the victim had any chance to resist. The cleanliness of the scenes suggested the offender might have been accustomed to minimizing traces. When the hypothesis of a serial offender was put on the table, no one in the room voiced opposition, but no one could confirm it either. Everyone understood that in 1998, no technology existed to verify a behavioral chain through DNA or genetic analysis. There was no physical basis to link the 3 cases. Only a behavioral model existed, but a model isn't evidence. Still, the comparison chart was carefully preserved in the file, marked with the red symbol of the cold case unit. It became an internal document that investigators treated as a different lens on Gwen's case, one that placed her not just as the victim of a single night, but as someone standing in the middle of a chain of unexplained events. At this point, Gwen's case was no longer just a standalone disappearance. In the eyes of the cold case unit, it began to take on the color of a piece belonging to something larger yet not clear enough to name, not evidenced enough to close or open a new investigative direction. A file still cold, but now positioned between 2 others, sharing the same chillingly silent traces. In 2025, when the statewide cold case review program was rolled out across the county, Gwen's case was placed on the priority list thanks to the behavioral overlaps that had once caught the cold case unit's attention. Evidence from years ago was pulled out of storage. The frayed nylon cord, the keychain fragment still bearing scratch marks, dust samples clinging to the alley floor, and an evidence bag containing traces of unidentified liquid recovered from the surface of a metal object. All of these had once been deemed unanalyzable back in 1987. Now, with ultra-sensitive DNA extraction technology, technicians elevated the samples onto the analysis table with the hope of finding what the previous generation of investigators could not. The nylon cord, though old and exposed to sun and wind for many years, still retained a very small amount of organic residue at the frayed section. Under high-powered microscopy, flattened and fragmented cells appeared as faint, scattered pieces. But the new generation DNA amplification system allowed replication of the viable segments. When the analyzer ran its first data stream, a male genetic profile emerged with markers that matched none of Gwen's family members. Technicians then took DNA samples from the old liquid residue collected on the long-forgotten metal object. That residue had previously been considered too degraded to hold value, but 2025 technology permitted recovery of the weakened molecular chains. The results came back unexpectedly. This sample matched completely with the male DNA extracted from the nylon cord. This match prompted the forensics team to reopen every small sample collected from the alley area, including dust fragments once thought useless. A few of them contained very faint cellular traces, but enough to generate partial DNA profiles. When cross-compared, investigators discovered that 3 out of 5 of those samples carried the same male genetic sequence, establishing a single, unique male DNA profile tied to the scene. In many old cases, even one matching DNA sample would be a major breakthrough. In Gwen's case, finding multiple samples within such a small radius proved that the same man had made direct contact with surfaces in the area where Gwen was separated from her path. What drew even more attention from the investigative team was that this male DNA profile did not appear in any state or federal criminal databases, meaning the man had never been arrested or had never had a biometric sample collected. That empty record further strengthened the likelihood he belonged to a group of offenders who had operated under the radar for many years. With this result, for the first time since Gwen vanished, the investigative team had the opportunity to pursue genealogical tracing, building family trees based on DNA to identify distant relatives of the suspect. The genetic sequence was uploaded to broad comparison systems, where millions of people had submitted DNA data for ancestry tracing. Sporadic low-percentage matches began appearing on screen, but enough to allow the genealogy specialists to construct family branches. When three separate branches consistently converged on the same geographic region, the seemingly scattered clues from 38 years earlier started to find points of convergence. While the genealogy team worked, the traditional investigative team digitized Gwen's entire file to reconstruct a complete forensic timeline. Every piece of evidence, every statement, every noted position was digitized and repositioned onto a three-dimensional map of the Compton area from 1987. They reconstructed the brightness of each street light from that year using utility company records, simulated witness lines of sight based on pre-era housing specifications, and re-established alley width, trash bin positions, and wall heights from building documents. When the new DNA data was overlaid on the forensic map, Ray Morris clearly saw what had previously only been speculation. The man who approached Gwen had stood in the alley's dark zone long enough to leave biological traces on object surfaces. DNA appearing on the nylon cord, the liquid residue, and ground dust showed the suspect hadn't merely passed through, but had directly interacted with the environment. This shattered the old 1987 hypothesis that the perpetrator had only brushed past in a few seconds. Instead, the biological traces proved the restraint action likely involved pulling, turning the body, or securing something, causing DNA to shed from skin, sweat, or epithelial cells. The forensic timeline, therefore, became far more vivid. Ray realized the perpetrator's movements weren't a spontaneous reaction, but a sequenced series of actions, almost technical in nature. No strong confrontation marks, no loud noises, no scattered items, no clear shoe prints. Every trace demonstrated tight control. The investigative team concluded that the perpetrator was extremely dangerous. He didn't just choose the right spot, he knew exactly how to strike without creating any clues, easily detectable by the technology of that era. He was calm enough to prevent the victim from screaming and strong enough to neutralize her in seconds. The DNA overlap across multiple samples further showed the perpetrator didn't act hastily but made direct contact with the victim or tools during restraint. From the forensic reconstruction, Ray noted that his behavior wasn't impulsive or fumbling but followed a pattern typical of someone experienced in manipulating another person's body in confined spaces. Once the digital file was complete, the investigative team had a clearer forensic picture than ever before. DNA became the first piece strong enough to pull Gwen's case out of decades of deadlock. The new data sharpened the image of the man who separated Gwen from her familiar path, in the eyes of the investigative team no longer just a description of a tall figure with a hoarse voice in the shadows, but real biological traces existing on every molecule of evidence from that night. When the suspect's DNA profile was built to a level of completeness sufficient to run through genealogy systems, the analysis team proceeded to upload the genetic sequence into civilian databases and commercial genetic platforms capable of matching millions of samples. The first results appeared as very low percentage connections, mostly distant relatives scattered across multiple branches, with no one close enough to be a direct suspect. However, those distant links themselves created an ancestral map that the specialist team began piecing together section by section. 3 branches were identified with higher-than-random overlap, one rooted in Nevada, one in Arizona, and one in Southern California. Though geographically distinct, all 3 branches shared a common ancestor several generations back, allowing the analysis to narrow down to a Southern U.S. lineage that had migrated across multiple states in the previous century. The genealogy team compiled public data from birth certificates, death records, residency files, school lists, and military information to construct a family tree spanning nearly a century. As names were connected generation by generation, the analysis team began filtering for male individuals in the age range potentially relevant to Gwen's 1987 case. From dozens of names spread across several states, they eliminated those who had died before the case date, those who had never lived near California, and those whose public DNA profiles didn't match. After hours of cross-referencing, the list narrowed to 19 men across the 3 branches. The investigative team continued elimination by examining alibis and other factors. Some were serving in the military overseas in 1987. Others lived in states too far away like Georgia or Colorado with no plausible reason to be in Compton. A few had medical histories that ruled out a tall build, or sufficient physical strength to subdue a victim. After applying these filters, the list shrank to 9 men. The genealogy group dug deeper into height, weight, hair characteristics, voice traits, employment history, and movement patterns during the periods relevant to the case. They noted that some men in the list had their voices described in old local council meeting records, but none were reported as having an unusually hoarse voice. One was a long-haul truck driver who rarely spent time in California. Another was a firefighter on consistent day shifts, making evening activity unlikely. After this process, 7 men remained. All 7 belonged to the same extended family group, sharing a common ancestral branch about 3 generations back. And all 7 had lived in California at some point during the 1980s to 1990s. The investigative team began analyzing each man's lifestyle habits by pulling rental records, employment files, tax declarations, and movement documentation. Of the 7 suspects, 2 lived more than 60 miles from Compton in 1987, with jobs and schedules showing no indication they had ever been near Gwen's disappearance area. Another was eliminated immediately upon cross-checking age, build, and medical history. He had undergone vocal cord surgery, completely altering his voice in a way that didn't match the descriptions from the 3 women who had been followed. The remaining 3 partially fit, but none produced a strong match with witness descriptions. Only one man, positioned in the middle of the analysis chart, caused those in the room to pause longer than usual. His name was Daniel Knox. Knox's record showed he had lived in Carson, just about 10 to 12 minutes drive from Gwen's disappearance location in 1987. Knox worked in mechanics at a garage near Alameda Road, with irregular shift hours that allowed him to be in Compton in the evenings without leaving a clear trail. As the investigative team read deeper into old interview documents from that era, one small entry stood out. A woman had reported being followed by a tall man with long brown hair and an empty gaze matching the description reported by 3 other women years later. Employment records indicated Knox was around 6'2", with a weight consistent with someone capable of subduing a victim without noise. His residence at the time also sat along a route that permitted easy in and out access to the Compton residential area without using busy main roads, a detail aligning with the behavioral pattern Ray Morris had built in the digital forensic file. Knox had no major prior criminal record, but there were a few minor reports of disruptive behavior or unwanted approaches toward women. Those reports had never elevated him to suspect status because there was no strong evidence and no one pursued them deeply enough to link them into a pattern. However, in the context of the consecutive disappearances and the DNA trail now guiding the way, Knox emerged as the most prominent name among the remaining 7 suspects. When the investigative team examined his residency history, they discovered Knox had moved multiple times between 1985 and 1990, making his movements hard to track at the time. The locations where Knox had lived were all near industrial zones and abandoned parking lots environments similar to the spot where Gwen vanished. This coincidence forced the entire team to note that Knox was the only name on the list converging the most behavioral, geographic, and biological factors, fitting the suspect profile they were reconstructing. DNA genealogy hadn't just yielded distant relatives, it had narrowed the suspect pool to a very tight circle, where the name Daniel Knox stood at the center like a strange bright point emerging from the 38-year darkness in Gwen Porter's file. Daniel Knox's personal file, when opened on the investigation table, revealed a series of disjointed data points that, when pieced together, formed the image of a man carrying traits impossible to overlook. Knox had worked at a mechanics garage just a few miles from the area where Gwen disappeared. The garage operated late into the night, even pulling all-nighters on days when they had to repair vehicles for long-haul drivers. This explained how Knox could be around Compton during hours when few people were still out on the streets. Co-workers who worked alongside Knox described him as quiet, someone who kept his distance, but who observed others in an unsettling way, as if evaluating them rather than simply interacting. One colleague recounted that Knox was usually friendly with male customers, but when the customer was a woman, his gaze changed, becoming probing and overly focused, creating an unnatural feeling. A woman once reported this during a police interview when the garage was briefly investigated for a minor matter. though Knox himself was not considered a suspect at the time. Outside of work hours, Knox had a habit of wandering around residential neighborhoods, often walking through dark alleys to relieve stress, according to his own words. A few residents near the garage had reported seeing Knox standing near abandoned parking lots locations that overlapped with part of the route Gwen took. Occasionally, police received complaints about strange footsteps behind some women, and when they turned around, they saw a tall man with long brown hair and an unreadable gaze. Though no one was attacked at those moments, the reports were logged in public files, and now, when placed alongside the descriptions from the three women in recent statements, the matches became striking. Knox had once been warned by police for lingering too long near the grocery store where Gwen worked. On another occasion, he was cautioned for following a woman all the way to her parking spot, but there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. At the time, incidents like these were typically viewed as minor disturbances and didn't lead to prosecution. However, for the investigative team in 2025, these fragments carried significant weight because they repeated the pattern of a deliberate stalker. When incorporating this information into the prior behavioral model, Ray Morris realized that the descriptions from the previously followed victims matched almost perfectly with Knox's build and demeanor. Tall, long brown hair, empty gaze, hoarse voice, and a habit of appearing in the shadows in low-traffic areas. Beyond appearance and habits, Knox displayed another key trait fitting the night predator profile: static observation ability. People who knew him said Knox could stand for hours just watching traffic flow or people pass by without showing any emotion. He didn't talk much, but his presence created a sense of being watched. He wasn't the type to rush in immediately, but the type who spent time observing, waiting for the exact moment when the victim was no longer in a safe zone. This aligned perfectly with the forensic timeline reconstructed from Gwen's crime scene. Another detail that stood out was that after 1987, Knox moved residences repeatedly. Residency records showed he left Carson a few months after Gwen disappeared, moved to a suburban area, then left again shortly afterward. Knox's residency pattern showed signs of avoiding stability, as if worried something might catch up to him. He stayed in each place only a few months before moving on again without clear work or family reasons. For an ordinary person, this might mean seeking new opportunities, but for a potential suspect in a missing persons file, it was a noteworthy movement pattern. Ray Morris noted that leaving the area near the crime scene shortly after the incident could have been an attempt to avoid recognition or fear that police would come looking for him. Frequent moves are a classic sign of offenders who know they left some risk behind in the past and want to distance themselves from it. When the psychological analysis group reviewed Knox's file, they found his behavior consistent with indicators of a sadistic sexual offender. Without needing a prior record of violence, many in this group start with stalking, narrowing targets, controlling victims from afar before acting. Individuals in this category often prefer preparation and planning over impulsive action, and their acts typically occur in isolated, low-light, low-traffic zones, where they can exert power over the victim without interruption. Knox's empty gaze, as described by witnesses, fit the emotional detachment pattern, a sign of someone with issues in empathy or understanding others' fear. The hoarse voice again became a key element in the profile because predators of this type often have identifying features that victims remember without being able to describe in detail. The psychological profile built around Knox centered on a man accustomed to nighttime activity, capable of long-distance victim surveillance, patient in target selection, skilled at using darkness as part of his tactic, able to approach without noise and without creating obvious struggle traces. That behavior showed confidence and experience, matching the forensic timeline signs that the person who contacted Gwen had carried out the restraint with complete control. All the pieces of Knox's past, from work habits to movement patterns, from constant changes in residence to reports of following women when laid out on the analysis table, formed a clear psychological profile. He wasn't just a match for witness descriptions, but converged the typical traits of a predator with deviant motives and high capacity for harm. The profile was completed like a portrait that no longer carried the vague outlines of shadows in Compton's alleys, but became the concrete image of a man named Daniel Knox. When Daniel Knox's file became clearer, the investigative team returned to a detail that had once been considered too vague in 1987. A witness statement claiming to have seen a light-colored car parked near the alley where Gwen disappeared. At the time, this information was downplayed because it lacked a license plate, lacked a clear make description, and was only a hazy memory from a passerby who said the car was silver or white and parked tight to the curb as if waiting for someone. Now, with Knox as the central focus, the investigative team wanted to verify whether he had ever owned or had access to a vehicle matching that description. They fed Knox's data into the DMV system to pull his vehicle records from the 1985 to 1990 period. One result appeared. Knox had registered a silver sedan, an older model that had passed through several previous owners before being transferred to his name in early 1987. Notably, DMV records showed this car was sold by the next owner just a few months later, in the fall of the same year. From there, the vehicle passed through 3 more owners before disappearing from the system in 1991. The data gap forced the investigative team to backtrack through old addresses, requiring contact with previous owners or their relatives. One former owner said the car had been sold in unstable mechanical condition, and he no longer remembered the final buyer. But an old notation slip found in the DMV file box recorded that the car had once been transported to the Victorville area. That note helped the investigative team identify a large salvage yard in the region, likely to store abandoned vehicles from the 1990s. An investigative group immediately headed to Victorville, where rusted cars were stacked under the dry, scorching California desert sun. The salvage yard manager confirmed he had received an old silver sedan in the early 1990s, towed in with a non-starting engine. Though many years had passed, he still remembered the car because the body was dented on one side, matching the description in the DMV file. After searching among hundreds of car husks, they spotted the silver sedan covered in dust and rust, with a cracked windshield and no handle on the rear door. But the VIN number remained legible enough for comparison. The VIN matched exactly with Knox's DMV record. The forensics team immediately cordoned off the area around the car and removed it from the yard for detailed technical analysis. They examined the car's interior in its time-corroded original state. Torn seat cushions, exposed foam padding, rotted dashboard. However, areas shielded from sun and rain like seat crevices, under seats, and door frames still retained organic traces. In the rear seat crack, they found a dark brown dried stain. When the sample was collected and analyzed using deep DNA extraction technology, the results showed it was blood from an unidentified woman. The sample didn't match Gwen, but when comparing molecular structure, this blood sample shared many similarities with the type of bodily fluid once found at the disturbed plot where the hair not belonging to Gwen appeared. This forced the investigative team to note that the car had once been in contact with another woman. At the front passenger seat footwell, the technical team discovered 2 long brown hairs. Analysis confirmed these were not Gwen's hair, but they matched the shade and brittleness of the hair fragment found in the dug-up plot. This added another layer connecting the car to the chain of attacks on women in the same area. The nylon strands found under the car's floor mat drew even more focus from the forensics team. The color and material were identical to the nylon cord collected at Gwen's scene. Though nylon is a common material, the similarity between the 2 samples in fiber structure, twist, and fraying carried significant forensic weight. The match between the nylon in the car and the nylon at the scene opened the possibility that the vehicle had been used on the night Gwen was pulled from her route. When the investigative team compared the male DNA locations inside the car with the male DNA sample from the 1987 scene nylon, they found exact overlap. The male DNA in the car and the suspect DNA from the evidence matched each other. That result made the entire group nearly certain the silver sedan had played a role in transporting or restraining a victim. With the car once registered to Daniel Knox, the link between him and Gwen's scene became clearer than ever. The vehicle not only closely matched the vague 1987 witness description but also contained traces related to criminal activity from the same time period and same area. Investigator Ray Morris looked at the timeline diagram of Gwen's disappearance and saw that the distance from Knox's garage to where the car had been spotted took only a few minutes to drive. If Knox left the garage during that exact time frame and stopped at the alley, His actions fit the forensic timeline perfectly. From a hazy witness description, the silver car became the most important physical evidence tying Daniel Knox's file tightly to the night Gwen Porter vanished. With the male DNA in the car, matching the DNA recovered from the scene, the silver sedan in Victorville became a pivotal trace, an unavoidable piece of the puzzle, pushing the case forward a major step after decades buried under the dust of time. When the silver sedan in Victorville yielded forensic traces stronger than anything before, the investigative team decided they had to secretly surveil Daniel Knox to determine whether his genetic profile matched the DNA sample recovered from the 1987 scene. By this time, Knox was living a quiet, low-profile life, working for a small transport company on the outskirts of Los Angeles, with an irregular schedule, some days early shifts, others appearing near industrial areas in the evenings. To avoid alerting Knox, the surveillance team was split into multiple shifts, each maintaining enough distance to stay undetected while staying close enough to record his daily routines. They placed long-range cameras at road intersections, logging the times Knox left work, returned home, and the places he frequently visited. Knox traveled in an old dark gray pickup truck, unremarkable, but easy to raise suspicion if followed too closely. Therefore, the surveillance team constantly rotated vehicles and positions to prevent exposure. During the initial days of observation, Knox appeared consistent in his habits but remained constantly vigilant toward his surroundings. He often checked his rearview mirror longer than normal, and when parking in public lots, he chose spots hidden behind larger vehicles. The surveillance team noted that Knox walked quickly with his head slightly bowed, avoided speaking to anyone, and particularly kept his distance from women. This wasn't avoidance behavior, but rather a deliberate effort not to let his gaze linger on anyone long enough to draw attention. Throughout the surveillance, the investigative team could not approach Knox directly, as that could ruin all their covert efforts. Instead, they waited for an opportunity to obtain an indirect DNA sample from items Knox discarded. The chance came when Knox stopped at a convenience store near his workplace. He bought an energy drink can, drank half of it before stepping outside, and tossed the can into a public trash bin near the exit. An investigator positioned inside the store timed the moment precisely but kept enough distance to avoid suspicion. As soon as Knox drove away in his pickup, the investigator stepped out immediately, gloved up, retrieved the energy drink can from the trash, and placed it into an evidence bag. The item was sealed according to proper procedure to prevent cross-contamination. The can was delivered to the DNA lab within less than an hour. There, technicians decontaminated the surface, focusing on the rim where Knox had drunk directly. The sample was extracted using high-speed centrifugation, preserving the epithelial cells still clinging to the metal edge. After analysis, the DNA sequence appeared on the comparison screen. Technicians ran the sample against the profile generated from the nylon cord, liquid residue, and scene dust from 1987. The results displayed instantly as two perfectly aligned green rows. The DNA from the energy drink can matched exactly with the unidentified suspect DNA in Gwen's case. No margin of error, no deviation, no single point mismatched the original genetic sequence. The result notification reached Ray Morris, and the entire investigative team understood that what they had suspected all along was now confirmed by irrefutable biological evidence. Daniel Knox wasn't just a match for witness descriptions, wasn't just the former owner of a silver sedan containing traces of another woman, wasn't just someone with a nighttime stalking habit, wasn't just someone whose behavior and profile fit the predator model. His DNA was the DNA present on the night Gwen was restrained. This elevated Knox to the clear and indisputable #1 suspect position. The investigative team logged this into the file with the highest priority level. All data genealogy, forensics, timeline, vehicle evidence, behavior, movement history converged on Knox. The DNA result provided the necessary legal weight to proceed to the next step. Before applying for a search warrant, the investigative team continued surveillance for a few more days to confirm Knox's current residence and identify points to check inside the house or on his vehicle. They noted that Knox typically returned to his rented home late in the evening, always kept the doors tightly closed, and never had visitors. In the backyard, there were various old mechanical items, but investigators needed a warrant to examine them. When analyzing everything they knew, the investigators compiled a comprehensive report to present to the court. DNA match with evidence, the old car containing a woman's blood and nylon matching the scene, witness statements about a man following women matching Knox's appearance, nighttime habits and residence locations fitting the forensic timeline, along with his unstable post-1987 relocation history. The file was finalized and submitted to a judge to request a comprehensive search warrant, because at that point, all the pieces had begun fitting together, revolving around a single name: Daniel Knox. The search warrant was approved early in the morning, and while the sun had not yet risen above the low rooftops, the investigative team had already surrounded Daniel Knox's rented house. The house sat at the end of a quiet street, isolated from crowded residential areas, with a large backyard and piles of mechanical items stacked like a cluttered junkyard. Knox was subdued outside before he could react, while the search team moved straight inside to begin checking each room according to procedure. The interior was sparse but messy, like a place used only for sleeping, with no concern for decoration or comfort. The living room had almost no furniture except an old chair and a low wooden table. But the attention wasn't on the living room. It was on the locked door at the end of the hallway. The door was reinforced with a horizontal steel bar and multiple locks, unlike the other doors. After forcing it open, the investigative team stepped into the sealed room that Knox had hidden for many years. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with the smell of metal. Flashlight beams swept across and illuminated a series of restraint devices hanging on the wall. Nylon binding cords, handcuffs, leather straps, a set of hooks attached to the ceiling beam, and mechanical items modified to hold a body in place. Scratch marks on the wall showed something had once been dragged or rubbed hard against the surface. A metal chair stood in the center of the room, its four legs bolted to the floor to prevent tipping. The seat surface had deep, dark scratches of unclear origin but clearly not natural. On a small table next to the chair was a toolbox containing items that appeared designed to clamp, hold, or tighten. These objects had no reason to exist in an ordinary person's home. An investigator carefully collected each one because they were potential evidence of coercive control behavior. As they searched deeper into the room, a large metal cabinet was opened, containing several sealed boxes and bags inside. A silver metal box at the bottom felt heavier than the others, drawing the search team's attention. When opened, it revealed 14 undeveloped film rolls inside classic 35mm film, wound tightly in plastic cores, each roll bearing faint pencil markings with strange symbols like R1, G4, N8, but no clear dates. The film rolls were seized immediately. In a temporary photo processing room set up inside the investigative van, technicians began developing each roll one by one. As the first images emerged in the chemical tray, the atmosphere grew heavier. The frames showed women photographed from a distance, mostly while walking alone at night. The angles were low and tilted, often taken from shadows or behind obstacles, exactly the style of a stalker's photos. Through the first few rolls, no faces were recognized, but on the sixth roll, a technician paused and called Ray Morris over to look. The frame showed a distant shot. Gwen Porter walking close to the curb near the grocery store, head slightly bowed as if counting steps. Another frame captured her turning onto the street lined with low trees. Yet another showed Gwen's long shadow stretching across the concrete under a streetlight, right at the position later described by witnesses. The photos were taken on different days, as Gwen's clothing changed across the frames. This proved she had been under continuous surveillance before disappearing. A chill ran down the spines of everyone present, because this was no longer speculation or inference. It was direct visual evidence of deliberate, premeditated preparation. Not just Gwen. The rolls also contained images of many other women. Some were photographed while jogging in the evening, others while waiting for a bus, or stepping out of stores at hours when no one paid attention. A few faces appeared multiple times, as if Knox had observed them repeatedly over days. These women had not yet been identified at that point, but the repetition of frames showed they had once been targets of similar surveillance as Gwen. The discovery of the film rolls gave the investigative team a clearer understanding of the level of preparation in Knox's behavior. He wasn't an impulsive attacker who struck whoever was convenient. He spent time following victims, documenting their movements, finding weak points on their routes, identifying habits and times they appeared in darkness. The photos on the film weren't just evidence, they were a direct window into the psychology of someone who derived satisfaction from controlling and exerting power over others' fear. In the sealed room, another box contained new nylon cords, the same type as the strand found at the 1987 scene. Some rolls had been cut into short lengths, with ends frayed exactly like the piece recovered near where Gwen's keychain fell. This match confirmed a direct link between Knox and the scene on the night Gwen was restrained. On a work table against the wall, an old map of the Compton area was pinned full of small nails. Red circles marked numerous dark alleys, areas with weak lighting or low foot traffic. Some positions overlapped with where the three women had reported being followed. This showed Knox didn't just know the area, he had surveyed it thoroughly, marking advantageous spots for approaching victims without detection. The final two rolls revealed the most chilling images. Close-up shots of women's faces taken inside a space similar to this sealed room. None showed direct injury, but the camera angles and proximity indicated they had once been within Knox's control. Some images were blurry but clear enough to show restraints and immobile postures, reinforcing the hypothesis that this room wasn't just for storage, it had been used. When compiling all the findings in the house, the investigative team realized they were standing before the strongest evidence since the day Gwen vanished. A deliberate, systematic stalker, with tactics and equipment prepared over years. He documented victims, marked locations, stored binding tools, and archived images as part of deviant behavior. The sealed room, 14 film rolls, restraint devices, and traces matching Gwen's scene formed a complete picture. Daniel Knox's actions weren't a one-time incident, but a process built over many years, intentional and with clear objectives. Daniel Knox was brought into the interrogation room on the same day as the search, his wrists still bearing red indentations from the handcuffs. He sat on the metal chair, spine straight, eyes trying to maintain that familiar empty state the same way he had looked at the women in the film rolls. When the investigators explained the purpose of the interview, Knox just shrugged, his voice distinctly hoarse. "I don't know what you're talking about." He denied following women, denied ever being near Compton, denied any connection to the silver sedan, even though the DMV records clearly listed his name. At first, Knox held firm with a confident tone, as if replaying a familiar role, the role of someone who believes that if he denies hard enough, everything will pass. Ray Morris placed the developed photos on the table, sliding each one in front of Knox. A photo of Gwen walking with her usual demeanor, a photo of her crossing the corner, a photo of her in the alley, her footsteps casting a long shadow. When Knox's eyes flicked down for a moment, his confidence wavered just a split second, but long enough for Ray to spot the crack in his defenses. Knox tried to smirk. "Just pictures of some random girl. I don't know her." Ray didn't respond to the denial. He simply opened another roll. Images of other women. Then the third roll, with close-up shots taken from very near. Knox's faint reflection visible on a shiny glass surface. At that moment, Knox swallowed hard, a small reaction that said a lot. Another investigator stepped in and placed the metal box containing the binding cords and devices from the sealed room on the table. When Knox saw the nylon cord with frayed edges identical to the scene evidence, his face froze, the emptiness in his eyes replaced by something cornered. He growled, "You don't understand. I just kept that stuff. Doesn't mean I used it." Ray let a few seconds pass, watching how Knox avoided eye contact. Those reactions were noted in the behavioral analysis. Knox wasn't responding like an innocent person in shock. He was responding like someone whose hidden shell had been cracked, tensing, searching for an escape route. The tightening of facial muscles, the breath catching in his throat, the clenched hands were clear signs of someone weighing partial confession or crafting an alternative story. When Ray mentioned the DNA results, for the first time Knox sat silent, offering no reply. His lips pressed into a thin line. He stared down at the table so long that the room held only the sound of the ventilation fan. This silence wasn't resistance. It felt like the gradual collapse of a man who knew every exit door was slowly closing. "Do you want to explain why your DNA was at the place where Gwen disappeared?" Ray asked, voice even. Knox closed his eyes for a second, then spoke haltingly. "I passed by there. Maybe I left something without knowing." That flimsy explanation was enough for Ray to see that Knox had stepped away from total denial. An experienced offender rarely cracks this quickly, only when he feels the trap has fully closed. When Gwen's photo was placed back in front of Knox, he stared longer than at any other image. His gaze shifted, not empty anymore, but carrying the predatory glint seen in files of those who enjoy controlling victims. A suppressed excitement that didn't disappear. When Ray asked why he photographed Gwen over multiple days, Knox no longer denied it. He sighed, voice lower and hoarser. "I wanted to know when she went to work, when she came home. That's all." Ray noted this as drip-feed confession, admitting the lighter behavior first, dodging the heavier parts. Part of Knox's tactic was to admit surveillance to conceal the rest. When asked about the other women in the film roles, he said, "Just a hobby. I watched them. Didn't do anything." He avoided the word followed, avoided targeted, but his use of watched carried the hallmark of passive predatory behavior before turning active. The behavioral experts monitoring from the observation room through the screen believed Knox was aroused by the helplessness and lack of awareness in women. The secret thrill of watching them pass through dark alleys gave him a special satisfaction, what many sadistic sexual offenders describe as power when the victim doesn't know they've been chosen. Ray moved to direct questions. "Did you put Gwen in the car?" Knox bit his lip, jaw muscles working, looking away. "No," he answered, but the voice lacked weight. "Did you keep her in that room?" "I don't know who she is." He denied again, but this time too slowly, too off rhythm, no longer confident like at the beginning. When Ray repeated the question without pressure, without threat, simply placing the photos of the sealed room and Gwen side by side, Knox shifted posture repeatedly, a sign of heavy pressure. He began to drip out admissions about his habit of going out at night to observe, then said he sometimes followed others but never touched them. Every sentence evaded the core, yet revealed predatory habits. Walking along dark routes, seeking shadowed alley spots, standing in the dim space between streetlights and tree shadows. Ray asked, "How long have you been doing this?" Knox exhaled heavily. "Many years." "Why?" A long silence. "Because I like knowing they didn't see me." That statement dropped the room into another layer of cold air. It wasn't the excuse of someone who slipped up. It was the self-description of a deviant who found pleasure in manipulating unseen fear. When Ray asked Knox to reveal Gwen's location, his face shut down completely. No answer. No reaction. No more wavering like when looking at the photos. He just stared at the wall. Eyes cold again. He refused to confess. This fit the profile. Those who crave power often withhold the most important information as their ultimate asset. The final symbol of control. To break through this wall of silence, Ray switched to psychological tactics. Instead of confrontation, he lowered his voice and asked descriptive questions. "How long did you follow Gwen? Did you know she was afraid of the dark?" Those questions weren't meant to force a confession but to tap into Knox's need to display power. Men like him often open up when they feel they're being acknowledged as the one in control, not as the one cornered. Knox's eyes flickered a small reaction, but enough to show the tactic was hitting. He still didn't reveal the location, but his final answer in that day's interview cracked open part of the truth he had tried to keep. "I knew she would take that road. I knew exactly when she would turn." Those words were no longer denial. They were an admission of targeting, surveillance, and preparation. And they were the first words that irrevocably tied Daniel Knox to the night Gwen Porter disappeared. When Knox continued to remain silent about the location where he hid Gwen, the investigative team was forced to rely on his behavioral profile and movement habits from 1987 to narrow down the search area. The behavioral analysis experts reviewed the possible routes Knox might have used. Low-traffic roads, isolated hilly sections, paths leading out of Compton at night without drawing attention. Based on old residency data, his work schedule at the garage, and the areas he frequented during the period he surveilled victims, The forensics group realized Knox tended to choose wide, secluded, low-light locations that were difficult to trace. One area stood out: Angeles National Forest, not too far from Compton but remote enough for someone wanting to conceal a body to move without detection. The vast forest, with its steep terrain, numerous rock crevices, narrow trails, and soft soil, was ideal for the controlling and isolating psychology of Knox. A behavioral specialist determined that sadistic sexual offenders often return to places that give them a sense of power, not to look at them, but to feel the absolute stillness, something Knox had demonstrated through his empty gaze whenever darkness was mentioned. The search team deployed along routes that a 1987-era vehicle belonging to Knox could have traveled. They weren't looking for obvious burial signs like in standard searches, but for the location best matching the psychology of someone who wanted to erase traces and keep secrecy as part of their power. An area about 2 miles off the main road was selected because its terrain was steep enough to be hard to spot from a distance, yet flat enough for a prepared individual to operate quickly at night. The ground in this area had been affected by a wildfire in 1992, greatly altering the surface and making it very difficult to identify a spot disturbed back in 1987. The K-9 team went in first, tracking deep, decomposed organic scents beneath the soil. For many hours, there were no signals. But toward late afternoon, one K-9 stopped at the base of a low bush. It barked briefly, then scratched at the ground as if recognizing an unnatural soil layer. When the forensics team arrived, they noticed the ground was slightly sunken, not much, but enough for experienced eyes to spot the difference. Beneath that layer, they began digging with small tools to avoid damaging evidence. Just minutes later, a small ivory-white bone fragment emerged, with no remaining soft tissue. As they expanded the dig, portions of a young woman's skeletal remains were unearthed. A long nylon cord lay close to the bones, buried along with soil movement over the years. When removed, on-site quick analysis showed the fiber structure and twist pattern identical to the nylon found where Gwen was separated from her root. No one had any doubt left. They had found Gwen. The skull showed a long crack in the temporal region, a type of injury consistent with a hard blow from a blunt object, matching the behavior of a perpetrator wanting rapid control without giving the victim time to resist. The neck bones displayed signs of forceful pulling and jerking, a type of trauma common in sadistic attacks where the offender tests power over the victim's body. Several old cracked ribs suggested Gwen may have been held tightly in a fixed position, similar to the pattern in Knox's sealed room. The nylon cord wrapped near the neck and arm bones led experts to conclude she had been bound with the exact material Knox stored. When forensics examiners used light and magnifying glasses to analyze the soil clinging to the cord, the clay and small gravel composition matched samples taken from the area where Gwen disappeared, proving the cord had been used there before she was placed in the vehicle. A small scrap of fabric remained in the soil layer, almost completely decomposed, with a faint pattern that the family confirmed belonged to the shirt Gwen wore the day she vanished. The match of bones, evidence, and nylon cord created absolute certainty. Gwen's death was not an accident, not a voluntary disappearance. It was deliberate homicide, bearing the mark of a sadistic killer who repeated patterns of control and infliction of pain before taking life. When connecting all the facts on the forensic timeline board, Ray Morris marked each stage. Gwen was surveilled for multiple days. Knox selected the exact route he approached during the 6 to 7 minute blank window. Rapid restraint with a blow to the head. Nylon used to bind hands or neck. Gwen placed in the vehicle. Departure from Compton via back roads. Arrival at Angeles National Forest. And burial in darkness. All of it occurred within a few hours, following the exact pattern of a prepared predator. What was unearthed wasn't just Gwen's remains, but the missing piece of the behavioral picture the investigative team had tried to assemble for decades. With the cause of death determined, matching evidence identified, and the forensic timeline completed, Gwen Porter's case finally had resolution after 38 years, shrouded in the darkness of Angeles Forest and the darkness of a man named Daniel Knox. With the discovery of Gwen Porter's body and the matching nylon cord to the 1987 evidence sample, the criminal case against Daniel Knox was completed sufficiently for the Los Angeles County District Attorney to proceed with prosecution on the three most serious charges: kidnapping, murder, and torture murder. This trio of charges fully reflected the nature of the case: a deliberate kidnapping combined with torture and homicide following a sadistic pattern prepared over multiple days in advance. When Knox was placed in temporary holding, the lead prosecutor in the case began assembling the evidence collected from his home, from the silver sedan in Victorville, from the Compton alley scene in 1987, and from the Angeles National Forest area. The undeveloped film rolls capturing Gwen over multiple days became the centerpiece of the indictment, as they proved Knox had not encountered Gwen by chance, but had systematically surveilled her. Enlarged frames showed Knox positioned near blind corners to photograph her from behind, changing locations multiple times to track her work and home routes. The prosecution presented this not as harmless observation but as deliberate preparation consistent with the type of offender who enjoys control and target selection. The photographic evidence opened an undeniable level of intent. From there, the prosecution reconstructed the specific timeline of the crime process. Knox surveilled Gwen for at least a week before the act, determined the time she left the grocery store, chose the dimly lit alley segment as the approach point, and calculated the window when no one would appear. Not only the images, but the evidence from Knox's home played a major role in the indictment. The sealed room was described as an isolated space, designed for binding and controlling victims. The restraint devices, straps, metal chair bolted to the floor, and modified mechanical tools for holding a body demonstrated that Knox engaged in real preparation not limited to observation or fantasy. The nylon cord from his room matched the nylon at the Compton scene and at the location where Gwen's remains were found. The prosecution argued that the nylon cord was the tool Knox used to restrain Gwen evidence, appearing at all three critical points: where she was taken, where she was transported, and where she was buried. This chain of matches strengthened the murder charge and added weight to torture murder, which requires proof of intentional infliction of pain or control before killing. DNA became the final linchpin, affirming that no one but Knox was present at the scene. The DNA sequences from the nylon, the liquid residue, the clinging dust, and the silver sedan all matched the DNA sample collected from the energy drink can Knox discarded. This was irremovable and unexplainable evidence in any other direction. The prosecution called DNA the backbone of the case, because it connected pieces of evidence existing across three different environments over 38 years. Not only DNA, but the traces of another woman's blood in Knox's car, even though not Gwen's, were introduced in the indictment as supporting evidence to illustrate his behavioral pattern. The prosecution did not charge Knox for other victims, but used this detail to reinforce the pattern. Knox had previously left traces of a restrained woman in his vehicle. This supported the argument that his motive and habits were not impulsive. The motive described in the charging document was sexual deviance, combined with a fixation on power. Behavioral experts presented that Knox derived pleasure from being close to victims without their knowledge, from photographing them at a distance, and from imagining or carrying out control over their bodies. The psychological profile was introduced by the prosecution as the explanation for behavior spanning many years, a form of violence driven by the need for absolute domination before taking life. The film rolls containing images of 14 other women, though not directly linked to Gwen's case, were used by the prosecution to demonstrate Knox's prolonged and systematic predatory behavior. Images of the followed women were included in the description of pre-offense conduct, showing he had repeatedly sought targets before deciding to act. The indictment was detailed to the point that every piece of evidence was placed in its exact position on the forensic timeline. Images of Gwen captured on day 1, 3, and 6. The nylon cord appearing in the alley. The keychain fragment falling at the spot where Gwen was pulled away. The silver sedan leaving Compton within the matching time frame, and the remains buried at a location consistent with his travel radius. The prosecution asserted there was no reasonable gap to explain the convergence of each piece of evidence in any other direction. The forensics team finalized their report, clearly stating the cause of death: severe head trauma, combined with strangulation by force from the nylon cord, consistent with the pattern of a sadistic offender. The mechanism of death was described as a combination of inflicting pain and absolute control. This made torture murder the most accurate charge, precisely reflecting the crime. When the prosecution file was completed, the district attorney held an internal meeting to prepare for trial. They organized the witness order, from the 1987 witness who saw the light-colored car, to the DNA experts, behavioral specialists, and finally the film processing technician. All data was compiled into a seamless logical chain intended to prove that Daniel Knox surveilled Gwen, selected her as a target, kidnapped her, tortured her, and murdered her in a manner consistent with the entire pattern of behavior he maintained for years. With everything collected, the prosecution of Knox not only reflected the brutality of the crime, but also represented the final step to bring a case that had stretched 38 years into the criminal trial process. The trial of Daniel Knox took place in the middle of 2025, drawing major attention because the case had stretched across nearly 4 decades and because of the sheer weight of the evidence system the prosecution had prepared. In the courtroom, the prosecutor stood before the jury and reconstructed the entire night Gwen Porter disappeared, using the forensic timeline painstakingly built by the investigative team. On the large screen, the Compton map from 1987 appeared. Each point of Gwen's movement, marked with red light. The grocery store, the alley, the position where the keychain fell, and the disturbed brush area. As the lighting shifted to simulate the darkness of that night, the prosecutor described how Knox appeared in the shadowed zone, approached Gwen during the 6 to 7 minute blank window, subdued her with forceful impact, and pulled her away from her familiar route. Next, the prosecution displayed forensic segments describing the nylon cord, the DNA locations, and the path of the silver sedan. Each piece of information was linked together by physical data collected from multiple different sites but now arranged into an irreversible logical chain. When the developed film rolls were shown to the jury, the courtroom fell silent. The photo of Gwen walking in the night, the photo Knox had taken from a distance, revealing days of prolonged surveillance, was placed at the center of the prosecution's argument. This was not a spontaneous crime, the prosecutor said, voice steady but firm. This was a plan. This was predatory behavior. Then came the photos of other women, proving that Knox had a habit of nighttime stalking, not just Gwen. The unnamed faces in the images sent a chill through the entire courtroom. Each film roll became undeniable evidence. Knox recorded images of them not by chance, but as the initial step in target selection. When the prosecutor displayed images of the sealed room with the metal chair bolted to the floor and the binding devices laid out, many in the courtroom had to look away. The images needed no direct violence. The mere existence of the room was enough to affirm that Knox had prepared a space for controlling victims. Evidence from the sealed room was placed on the table before the jury. Nylon cords cut into lengths identical to the sample recovered from the scene. Metal tools bearing distinctive grinding marks. Hooks suspended from the wooden ceiling beam. Each piece was numbered and presented with forensic detail, making the prosecution's argument increasingly powerful. DNA became the most impactful element. The forensic technician was called to the stand and explained how the DNA from the nylon cord, from the scene dust, from the liquid residue, and from the silver sedan's interior, all matched the DNA collected directly from the energy drink can Knox discarded. The jury watched genetic charts appear as long columns of matching colors, every marker aligned perfectly. No one else left this genetic sequence, the DNA analyst said. Only one person, Daniel Knox. Knox sat at the defendant's table, hands clasped, head bowed. But each time Gwen's photo appeared on the screen, he lifted his gaze for just a moment, and his expression changed. He lost composure when the prosecution displayed the photo of Gwen taken the night before she vanished. He narrowed his eyes, lips trembling slightly, then turned toward his attorney as if seeking an anchor. But the defense attorney could not refute the scientific evidence. He tried to argue that DNA could have been cross-contaminated, but the forensic technician immediately rebutted by pointing out the uniquely individual genetic markers that could not be mistaken. He attempted to claim the film rolls were merely a photography hobby. But the number of women appearing in the images, the hidden angles from which they were photographed, and the fact that Knox captured Gwen over multiple consecutive days made that argument absurd before the jury. He continued to argue that Knox was just a collector of old items, so the presence of binding cords in the house did not prove criminal behavior. The prosecution immediately presented images from the sealed room, where nylon cords were hung systematically. some already cut and left with fraying identical to the scene sample. When the jury heard that the nylon still carried soil components matching exactly the alley where Gwen disappeared, the defense's objections lost all weight. Finally, when the medical examiner described the injuries to Gwen's skull and neck bones, and how they aligned with forceful restraint in a sadistic pattern, no one in the courtroom could maintain composure. Those descriptions confirmed that Gwen's death was not mere homicide, but a prolonged act by someone who found pleasure in the victim's helplessness. After 3 days of trial and more than 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. They did not look at Knox as they entered, only straight ahead toward the judge. The jury foreman read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Daniel Knox, guilty." The courtroom fell deathly silent as the words rang out, a simple sentence, yet carrying the weight of 38 years of buried truth. Knox sat motionless, his eyes no longer empty but darkened, as if the final layer of his control shell had just been stripped away under the undeniable light of evidence. After the 2025 trial concluded with a guilty verdict for Daniel Knox, the cold case unit entered the final phase of a journey that had spanned 4 decades, completing the comprehensive investigative report for the disappearance and murder of Gwen Porter. This report was not just to close the file but also to analyze all the reasons the case had remained unsolved for 38 years, clearly documenting the errors, limitations, and things the 1987 investigative team could not have done differently due to the technology of that era. In the opening section of the report, the investigative team emphasized that in 1987, police lacked DNA tools powerful enough to process extremely small samples. The epithelial cells stuck to the nylon cord, dust containing biological traces, or dried liquid on the metal evidence, could not be analyzed. What later became golden evidence was all considered of no usable value at the time Gwen vanished. Many key pieces of evidence were collected properly, but the era lacked the capability to decode them, leaving the efforts of the investigators at that time in deadlock despite following every possible procedure. The report noted one significant administrative error. A piece of evidence containing a biological sample was mislabeled, causing it to be filed in the wrong drawer and not further analyzed for many years. That mistake had no legal consequences, but it clearly illustrated the gap between the storage systems of the 80s and modern forensic standards. Manual evidence management created risks of loss, causing many clues to fall into silence simply because they were not discovered at the right time. The report also analyzed environmental factors in 1987. Compton at that time lacked public cameras, had insufficient strong lighting, low witness density at night, and neighborhood structures, with many hidden alleys that created conditions for organized criminals. Knox knew this area well and understood how to hide in the darkness, approaching victims without making noise. The investigators from that year had to rely almost entirely on vague statements, and this caused the case to slip from their hands right from the first hours. The next section of the report was dedicated to describing the turning point after more than 3 decades, the emergence of new generation DNA technology, devices capable of extracting degraded samples, recovering biological molecules from just a few cells, and assembling genetic sequences from soil dust, completely changed the situation. The report clearly presented that without the new technology, the nylon cord and metal object would forever remain unnamed evidence in storage. Without modern comparison techniques, no one could have extracted the male DNA sequence that had clung to the nylon since 1987. In particular, the most emphasized part was the role of genealogy. The report described the process of building the family tree as a hunt for the perpetrator's ancestors to identify who he is in the present. Through genetic comparison with distant relatives in the system, investigators narrowed down the remaining suspects to just 7 people, then narrowed further to finally name Daniel Knox. The report recorded that the genealogy method not only helped identify the suspect, but also clearly showed how genetic mechanisms in family branches allowed elimination one by one, based on gender, age, residency, and movement history. The investigative team called this method the bridge between modern science and the gaps of the past. When Knox was arrested and tried, the cold case unit realized they had not just solved one case, but had touched the fragile boundary between failure and hope in criminal investigation. Therefore, They decided to incorporate Gwen Porter's case into the official training program for young investigators. The report described in detail every overlooked error, every seemingly tiny piece of evidence that became a key, and every way Knox exploited lighting structures and victim routines. Each chapter emphasized one simple but crucial principle. No evidence is meaningless. Only science has not yet been sufficient to decode it. In the final evaluation section, the cold case unit officially closed Gwen Porter's file. The line "case closed, 38 years open," was entered into the system with both relief and heaviness. Relief, because justice had been served. Heaviness, because the case showed how many other victims from the pre-DNA era may have been rendered invisible simply because the tools were not strong enough to protect them. The report ended with a summarizing statement. All evidence, images, physical items, DNA, film rolls, the sealed room, the nylon cord, the forensic timeline points in only one direction. Daniel Knox is the sole perpetrator, the only one fully responsible for the death of Gwen Porter. No accomplices, no other links, just one predator who hid in the darkness of Compton in 1987. With those words, the case that had lasted 38 years was completely closed, and Gwen Porter was finally given back the truth that had been taken from her on that foggy night. The story of Gwen Porter and the 38-year journey to uncover the truth is not just a sentence for Daniel Knox, but also a powerful reminder for life in the United States today, where communities still face hidden dangers in the shadows of residential areas, dimly lit alleys, and gaps that technology has not yet filled. The fact that Gwen was stalked for many days proven through the film rolls. Knox secretly took shows that predatory behavior rarely happens impulsively. It often starts with repeated observation, with the offender deeply understanding the victim's habits. This is a lesson in vigilance. Any unusual change around the home, any stranger appearing multiple times on the same route, needs to be noted and reported. Knox's behavior of choosing isolated spots, dim lighting, and waiting in the 6 to 7 minute blank window also reflects a reality. Personal safety depends not just on physical strength but on awareness of surroundings. Walking alone at night, especially in poorly lit areas, remains a major risk in many communities across the United States. From California to Texas, from New York to Michigan, modern DNA technology and genealogy, the factors that crack the case, remind us that science can support justice but cannot replace societal vigilance. Tiny pieces of evidence like the nylon cord, unfamiliar hair, or photos taken from hidden angles only have value when collected at the right time. This suggests a lesson for families and communities. Never ignore any unusual sign, no matter how small. Finally, the case emphasizes that women's safety remains an urgent issue. From Gwen's story, the practical lesson for people in the United States today is: build vigilant communities, improve public lighting, report stalking behavior no matter how minor, and trust in the power of science to protect the most vulnerable. Gwen's story is not just a personal tragedy, it is a wake-up call for all of us. If Gwen Porter's story reminds us of the importance of vigilance and justice, please hit subscribe to continue joining us on the journey of retelling cases illuminated by persistence and science. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where every story is a reminder to protect ourselves and our community.